All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. It's been quite a while since I have done one of these lectures because I've been doing other things. But I'm going to right now be going over Chapter 14 from our textbook, ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS, which is the textbook we're going to be using, supposedly, for the AWD1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD or Application and Web Development Program. Now I've gone through the first 8 chapters and part of Chapter 9, but I've decided to skip ahead and basically do chapters 14 through 18 and then go back again. All right, so chapters 14 through 18 are a lot talking about CSS. Okay, and it says over the next few chapters we're going to introduce how to use cascading style sheets or CSS in order to change the look and feel of the website. And that's what they do. All right. Now they mention in this note here, to complete the chapter you must either have completed chapter 10 or chapter 13 if you intend to deploy this, etc. So what I've decided to do is just I went out to the ASP.NET website, copied all the code in here, and there's the chapter 13. All right, so I'm going to copy that. Kind of be nice if I had the original. Paste. And let's just call this chapter 13. Okay? Right there. All right, so this is the baby store through chapter 13. Hopefully we can open it up this way. And we're just about ready. So while we're waiting, let's take a look at this. The author says that he included this section in the book because the world of web development is evolving to something where developers need to have a more well-rounded skill set. If you've ever heard the term full stack developer, as he says right here, which basically, for lack of better words, what it means is that many web developers today have to be both front-end and back-end developers. Now, most of this book has centered on the back-end using ASP.NET with C#. But often today, especially in shops that are smaller in size, you may also have to be a front-end developer where you need to know CSS, etc. Okay? So the author says, throughout the examples on CSS, I try to keep the HTML as close as possible to the current state. Therefore, there are times we will use similar features to those used in Bootstrap. And when they do that, they'll try to give a detailed explanation of how the code works. In other words, what the author is trying to do is make this a CSS chapter. Okay? So he starts by going over some of the basics of CSS. Things like talking about styles, etc., how they're used, where they're used, etc. So let's take a look at this. All right, when you've got something in your CSS that looks like this, for lack of better words, let's just keep it really, really simple. All right. In English, forgetting about the word selector, declaration block, and all that stuff just for a minute, this says that what I want is in the body, all right, in the body of my page, I want it to have 20 pixels of bottom padding. Now, why would you want that? Well, when you use standard Bootstrap in a project, be it just an HTML document or be it in something like we're working on right now, quite often what happens is the Jumbotron can end up cutting off what goes down below it on a document. So by putting in 20 pixels of padding, what you end up doing is you end up not having the Jumbotron cut something off. So, as it says there, body, this is called the selector. Everything that's within here is known as the declaration block. All right? This is the property that we're changing. This is the value we're changing that property to. Since we have here padding bottom, the only thing we want to change is 20 pixels of padding on the bottom. Had we left this off and just said padding, that would have added 20 pixels of padding to the top, right, bottom, and left. All right. So as it says, this style effectively says to the browser, for the HTML body element, set the padding bottom property to 20 pixels. Okay. All right. So when you work with a style sheet, it says that a style sheet is a collection of CSS styles. And to be even simpler than that, there's really 3 ways that you can add styles, CSS styles, and work with them with an HTML document. The first way, and the one we won't use at all, is what's typically called inline CSS. And that's where you add styling directly to an element. All right, so rather than doing something like we did here, we would do this and apply this directly maybe to a paragraph or something like that. And that's typically referred to as inline CSS. Then there's internal CSS. With internal CSS, so look at it this way. With inline CSS, you're trying to change an element. With internal CSS, the CSS goes at the top of the page in the head section, and it goes in between style tags. And really with internal CSS, you're trying to change an individual page. You can also have external CSS, and with external CSS, the idea is you have a separate file that ends with a .css extension. All right. So it says styles can also be added outside of style sheets to individual. Yeah, we already talked about that. All right. Yeah. Okay, next they talk a little bit about selectors, and they say selectors fall into 2 different categories. Throughout the book, the HTML has included CSS classes. For example, when you see this. All right. The selector right here, the selector is a DL, which I believe is a data list element. And what we're saying is for that data list element, we want to apply the class DL horizontal. All right. Since this is a class, when we put it in there, we need a period. If instead of saying class we had said ID, we would put a pound sign. Sometimes people get confused over what's the difference between using a class and using an ID. The simplest way to look at that is to say that with an ID, there can be only one of them on a page, where with a class, there can be multiple. So if I wanted to use this on multiple places on a page, I would use it as a class. If I wanted to only use it at one place on a page, I'd use an ID. The author says here in this tip at the top of page 469 that IDs are best used sparingly, if at all. Again, different people have different opinions on this. And to be honest with you, in the end, that stuff is not really all that important. It really and truly is not. All right. Okay. To apply a style to more than one element at a time, you need to use a group selector. So in other words, this right here says what we want here is the text color to be set to 0000000, which is a total absence of color, which means black. So we want to say the text color should be black for all paragraphs and for everything with a class of DL horizontal. Since we put the comma in there, that says apply the same style to each of these different selectors. If we wanted to do everything, so if we wanted everything to be black, the text color, we could just use the asterisk, which is kind of the wild card or universal selector. All right. Next, they talk about descendant selectors. And it says descendant selectors match one tag within another. Okay? So if you look at this example that's right here, we've got a class of news, and that class of news has a span tag in it. That span tag has some text in it. So we've got the div here with a class of news, starts here, ends here. We've got the span with some text in it that starts here, ends here, and then we've got the text. All right. So it says if we wanted to style the span elements only within the news class, we can say this: dot news, because it's a class, span. So that would say, in this case, set the color, but only for span tags that exist inside of a class of news. All right. The author says you can also use the greater than sign to find only direct descendants. What's the difference? Well, if we had a span tag inside of a span tag, for example, all right, this may or may not find it. This would not find it. In fact, this first one would find it, but the second one, greater than, would say only a direct descendant. So if we had div greater than, for example, the example they show here, div greater than p, will find only the p tags that are direct descendants of a div tag. So if you had a div and then you had a span inside of the div and you had a paragraph inside of that span, the example here that's in the blue would not find it, because that paragraph would be a direct descendant not of the div but of the span. All right. Sibling selectors, as it says, they're used to select elements that are next to one another. You know, sibling relationship, brothers, sisters, whatever you want to call it. The most common, as it says, is the adjacent sibling selector. The example they give here is if you wanted to select every paragraph following an H1 tag, so the one right after it, you'd use the H1 plus P selector. Now, just so you know, before we're going to go into inheritance in just a minute, but before we do, I don't want to be too verbose here, but if you go out to W3schools.com, you'll find, if we go under tutorials here, there's Learn CSS. This is probably, especially when you're first starting out, let me give you the URL if you've got an interest in it. This is probably the best resource if you're first starting out with CSS. So there it is right there. In fact, we can make it even bigger. There you go. So if you are new to this, go to https://www.w3schools.com/CSS. I believe if you go right here to w3schools.com/CSS, I believe that'll find it as well. Let's check. So this is just w3schools.com/CSS. And you notice that brings you there also. Okay? All right. Inheritance refers to the way CSS applies a style that's applied to a parent to all of its child elements. By default, which means unless told otherwise, if you apply something, notice here, if you apply something to the body, here we're applying the Arial font family to the body. By default, then, the Arial font family will be applied to everything within the body. All right? Now, if you want to change that, you can. This is the whole idea of cascading, as it says here on the top of page 470. Cascading is the set of rules which decide which style properties get provided to the elements. And they're defined in 4 ways. And it actually goes from a minor to a major order. So it does the inline first, then the internal, then the external, then the browser. So this overwrites this overwrites this overwrites this, etc. Says when it comes to determining which style wins, so to speak, in the same style sheet, all right, typically IDs win out over classes, which win out over regular elements. And they give an example here. It's not a great example, to be honest with you. And they say here's a couple of rules that you should be aware of on the top of page 471. If two styles have the same equal specificity, the last one declared wins, the last entry on the style sheet. The other thing is, if you declare a style using the exclamation mark important, it will override any other rule except another important rule that follows it. The one thing I do want to tell you is if you're going to use this exclamation point important rule, all right, use it sparingly, because if you use it all over the place, you are misusing it. Now it says here if you want to find more, you can go out to here, and I'm going to allow this. This is going out to the W3C's, the World Wide Web Consortium's actual CSS level 3, which is the latest level, and you're going to find if you look through this, it's literally got everything on CSS version 3, the newest version, that you could be interested in. That's the good news. The bad news, unbelievably dry read. Okay? All right. The CSS box model. Did they show a picture here? They show some, but this is not what I want to show you here. So let me bounce back. And let's look at the box model. Every element that you have on a web page is in its own little box. Let's look here. CSS box model. I know that W3 Schools has got a picture of this. When you first go over this, it's a little hard to understand. But imagine for a second, all right, please imagine for a second that you have a paragraph. So your content here is a paragraph right there. That's a paragraph. All right, so that's the content. Around the content, what you end up having, I don't know why my screen just went bye-bye, is padding. So that's the area that is right around the content. By default, all right, it's transparent. Okay, in fact, it's always transparent. Then you've got a border. And the border is what separates the padding from the margin. Again, you don't have to set a border, but if you do, it is not transparent. You will actually see it. Then you've got the margin, and that's the area outside of the border. Again, by default, it's transparent. So the content, as it says, this is where your text appears, your images appears. That's your actual web page content. Around the content is the padding. Around the padding is the border, and around the border is the margin. You can change any or all or none of these. It says the box model allows us to add a border around elements and to define space between elements. And they've got examples here. So again, if we look at the example that they show here, okay, notice here we've got a background color of light gray, a width of 300. There's our border. All right. Now notice we've got a padding of 25 pixels here and a margin of 25 pixels. Let's change one of these. So let's change the padding to 125 pixels. All right. In fact, you know what? I'm going to grab their example. Sometimes these are the best examples of all. Not always. But I'm going to come up here and I'm going to put this in here, paste that in, okay? And I'm going to save that, and I'll save it right to my desktop as boxmodel.html. All right, this is the same exact thing that they just showed in the book. Let's run this, and there's what you get. Okay? So let's go back to the same example, and let's change the border so that instead of a 25 pixel border, let's make it a 125 pixel border. All right? Why? Hopefully you'll see why in just a moment. All right? So notice now, is that pretty obvious? That's the border. I made it 5 times as big as it was previously. Well, I don't want that. I just wanted to show that to you. All right. Let's take our padding, which was 25 pixels, and let's make it 100 pixels. All right. So now, notice this is our padding right here. And if you say, I don't remember what it looked like before, let's change it back again. So let's change it back to 25 pixels as it was before. Save it and refresh. Watch the area that's in here, the gray area. Pretty obvious? All right. Now I'm going to change the margin, and you'll notice that's the area outside of the border. So notice, again, there's the margin right here, right now. Let's go back in there and change that, and let's make that 100 pixels. And again, we'll refresh, and notice the area we have here now. So again, when you look at this, this is the content in here. It's the text and the gray area behind it. All right? Actually, it's the text that's in here. The area that's outside of the text right there, that's the padding. So the padding is the area between the content and the border. There's our border. And the area outside of the border, that's our margin. So you'll notice if I cut all of these down, so the width is fine, but I'm going to say there'll be, let's just say a 1 pixel border here. And we'll have no padding, and we'll have no margin. We'll save that, and please watch how this changes. All right, there is a very, very, very light green border around this. It's only 1 pixel. It was 25 pixels before, so it's 96% smaller than it was. We have said we wanted 0 padding, so there's nothing. These butt up basically right against this, or just about. We wanted 0 margin. If there's any padding or any margin left, that's because that's the default that gets put in by the browser, and you can change that as well. Now, hopefully, at least, that helped a little bit in your understanding of this. All right, let me check my time here. I'm at 22 minutes, so I've gone over the box model. I've gone over what borders are. I've gone over what margin, what padding is. We'll pick it up on the inline and block display in part 2 of this lecture in just a couple minutes.